Flashing forward to the 21st century, I'm going to ask the comparison and contrast question. Since the act of conversion is one of the key features of global evangelical Protestantism, what do you see as continuities with what you're studying, and what do you see as key differences as well in terms of the temporalities that are being dealt with?
Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert on the current moment,
give it your best shot.
But you know, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to begin the paper with Baldwin, right? So not a 21st century, but a 20th century conversion account, was to suggest that there are some potential parallels, and you know, Baldwin representing fictionally, but something autobiographically confirmable, something about his own experience as a teenager, does, I think, have a certain similar temporal sense. The whole novel works to this moment on the threshing floor, or this night on the threshing floor where he experiences his conversion. And I don't think we're meant to see that conversion as insincere in any way. The narrative works it through in a way that kind of, in an Agamben sense, recapitulates everything of the family history that has led to that moment, and that now is embodied in John's embracing of the Christianity, the Pentecostal Christianity of his family that he has resisted up until that point. But the aftermath of that, which is the scene I focused on, emphasizes that that is a complete transformation of self and of the world, and yet it doesn't do anything to the self and the world. And I think, you know, I mean, I think this, and yet, is absolutely central to Christians' senses, certain Christian senses of Christian identity, right? And maybe religious identity more generally in a lot of religious traditions, which is that, right, you are securely a Christian, and yet you have to re-embrace that identity over and over and over again. And so with the Mary Magdalene account, that's dramatized in the saint's life. But I do think that one of the things that makes, you see I'm avoiding the current moment again, one of the things that makes the text I'm working with in the Middle Ages written by converts, not just a kind of marginal cultural material, I think, is that those texts were being used not just by the converts to establish their positions in society, but by Christian institutions to think about Christian identity via this mirror of the convert, right? So a 12th century text, the Dialogues, written by Peter Alfonsi, also the author of the Disciplina Clericalis, which is the more famous of his works. But the Dialogues circulated in over 70 manuscripts, so, you know, medieval bestseller, not like, you know, Gregory the Great, but you know, really wide dissemination of this text written by a convert to, it's again, not just an autobiography, though there are autobiographical elements. It's mostly an anti-Jewish, but also an anti-Muslim polemic. But I think something about the status of it as a text by a convert spoke to Christian concerns about Christian identity more generally. And there are other texts like this, you know, from the 12th to the 15th century that really clearly have a cultural centrality that we might not expect of them. And I think there are ways of reflecting on Christian identity. So if we were to bring it back to the current moment, you know, there are a whole variety of ways and of reasons why conversion is important in evangelical Christianity, including, you know, kind of apocalyptic imaginations of conversion, especially of Jews, being necessary for bringing about the end time. And that's partly why Israel is important for American evangelical Christianity. But I also think that having converts around does foreground something about the normal religious experience that is validating, but also potentially uncomfortable, right? And so, so the dynamics around that get quite complicated. And I'd say, one of the ways I'm trying to think through some of this material and the temporality of it is to think about other experiences of radical change in the self that aren't specifically religious. So, transgender experience, maybe similarly, is important, right, to the thinking, right, both conservative and kind of transgressive or radical, the thinking of gender altogether, and its temporal complications, I think, have something to do with our with everyone's experience of a kind of sense of settled gender, and yet a sense that one's gender is never settled, no matter how much one insists that it is, right? Something like that. Yeah, Jess?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you see any significant temporal differences between medieval texts in which it's narrated, the writer is narrating her own conversion experience, versus medieval texts like the Mary Magdalene text, where it's representing an historical conversion. It's like a confessional text versus more of like a historical narrative.
I think there are lots of differences, and so I haven't tried this model, this 3-part temporal model, and tried it out fully on the more autobiographical conversion texts I'm working with. I think in some ways it works, and in some ways it would need to be recalibrated for those. So, in my earlier stuff, the way I dealt with the temporal dislocations of conversion was thinking through the figure of the specter, and particularly the Derridian formulations of spectrality and specters and marks. And you can see how that resonates with what I'm still doing. That is that the argument there is that the convert after conversion is still grappling with the ghost of the self that is the pre-conversion self. So that's the way I've tried to make sense of those, some of those narratives. I don't know, right? So a question would be whether the always already, right, really works with these conversion accounts, because they usually don't say, when I was 3 years old, I knew I was different from the other Jews around me. Right? There's an always already of autobiography that is available, right? But I didn't quite know how. And then, I met these Christians, and it all became clear to me. But there might be something like that implicit in some of the accounts, right? What happens with Herman Judah is the whole text is framed by a dream that he has when he's 13. And he dreams this allegorical dream that his uncle, Jewish uncle, interprets for him, saying, you're going to be rich and marry a great woman, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, don't forget that dream. And then he tells us the whole account of his life. He converts, and then in the last chapter he says, remember that dream I had when I was 13, right? Now that I'm a Christian, I understand its true meaning, and it's not these kind of material, allegorical fulfillments of the symbols in the dream. What stood for riches stands for God's grace, et cetera, right? It's quite predictable in a lot of ways.